This is the Gigabyte Aorus X470 Gaming 7 Wi-Fi. It's a pretty long name, but has a pretty interesting overall spec and is one of the most high-end boards you can get for the AMD Ryzen, especially second generation Ryzen CPUs, so let's take a look at it. Now first things first, I want to make it clear that this motherboard is backwards compatible with both the original 1000 series Ryzen chips and the new 2000 series Ryzen chips, so whatever Ryzen chip you want to use in it, feel free. You can also use X470, so if you want to pick up the last generation Gaming 5 or K7 from Gigabyte, let's say, then you can also grab those. Make sure they have a BIOS update and they will work with the newer 2000 series Ryzen chips as well, so that's pretty nice to see. Now with this being one of the highest end, if not the highest end board that Gigabyte is doing for the X470 chipset, that makes it pretty interesting. Kind of makes it the flagship, and we've got some really interesting and almost flagship style features here. The first thing I would really like to highlight is actually the Vrm Heat Sinks. Not only do they have a heat pipe connecting the two, but they're also an actual fin array as opposed to just a large block of metal on top, which means that the VRMs when using this motherboard were incredibly cool in the area of 50 or 60 degrees Celsius under full load with the stock chip, running upwards of 1.45 volts and at 4.3 gigahertz all core under load, so that's really very impressive. And if you are planning on picking up this board to overclock, the Vrm heatsink can definitely handle it. Of course, as with a lot of the more recent Gigabyte and Aorus style motherboards, you have reinforced RAM slots. I don't know that this is too necessary, but I guess it gives a nice enough aesthetic, so there's that. You also have a pretty nice looking chipset cooler, which is also pretty cool, and you also have 3 reinforced PCIe slots. Now these are sort of externally reinforced slots, so it's effectively a metal casing over the PCIe slot, but they're still nice and strong, will definitely hold up your graphics card nicely, so that's always nice to see. I believe the top 2 slots, the top 2 reinforced slots are X16s and pass straight to the CPU, whereas the bottom slot I believe is an X4 and passes through the chipset, so bear that one in mind. You'd also have 2 M.2 slots, both with M.2 kind of cooling plates on them, which is really nice to see. The top one is 22100 and the bottom one is 2280, so both of these will fit your standard M.2 SSD, something like your 960 Pros, very nicely, and you can run both of these in sort of NVMe RAID if you like. The one thing I'd mention is, as I understand it, I don't have a kind of block diagram for how this is fully connected, but as I understand it, the top one will be directly connected to the CPU, whereas I believe the bottom NVMe M.2 slots will be connected via the chipset, but make sure you check with Gigabyte on that one, as it may be connected differently. Now, as is the trend with a lot of these new motherboards, you have a lot of Rgb headers. You have an Rgb header for your CPU cooler next to the Vrm heat sinks. You also have a digital and a RGBW header at the top of the board next to a couple of your extra fan connectors and the interchangeable RGB strip on the side. And you also have another RGB, both a RGBW and a digital RGB header down the bottom next to your audio headers. You also have the new Type-C or 3.1 Gen 2 front panel header next to your BIOS switches, which is actually pretty nice to see, and the debug LED next to your 24 pin, and then you have 2 I believe USB 3.0 Gen 1 headers down the bottom, along with multiple USB 2s, your front panel audio headers, and your general front panel connectors. And speaking of the audio headers, I'd mentioned that the chip that they use for audio in this board is the Realtek ALC 1220VB, which makes it a very nice and pretty high-end motherboard in terms of audio, although of course you can go with an external amp and DAC if you want the cleanest of audio, but this one is going to do you pretty well. Now, a couple of extra things that I noticed with the board in terms of its connections are you have 8 total 4-pin PWM fan headers, which can all be controlled by the SmartFan 5 software, either in Windows or in the BIOS, which is pretty impressive. And you also have an 8 and a 4-pin CPU power connector for extra power delivery to what can be a potentially pretty beastly chip. Now, by far one of the most interesting features on the board that I had to actually ask Gigabyte about was actually the little chip housing that is next to the LED header and the VRMs and your CPU sockets. that is actually a replaceable BIOS chip, and that means that while they're not going to be offering, you know, spare BIOSes so that the pro overclockers who completely brick both of the BIOSes that are on the board can, you know, easily switch them out, it means that if you have trouble with the board, if you completely brick it for some reason, if you completely brick both BIOSes, you can't clear the CMOS, and for whatever reason it's just completely dead, Gigabyte can actually just ship you the BIOS chip for you to put in, as opposed to having to send them the motherboard and they try and reflash it for you or something like that, which is also really cool. The other thing to mention is that also if you buy this board and you end up wanting the 3000 series Ryzen chips, for example, they can actually ship you a pre-flashed BIOS so that they will, those chips will immediately work if you don't have an earlier version or an earlier chip that can work in this, especially if you end up buying this around about the time of the 3000 launch and you end up buying one that hasn't been pre-flashed to support those chips yet. So that is a really nice and very easy addition, so I'm actually really pleased with that. And before we jump into the BIOS, I just want to look at the rear I/O. So because this is the Wi-Fi model, you do have your Wi-Fi antennas available. You also have a power switch and a clear CMOS button on the back. You have 4 USB 3 ports, 2 USB 2 ports, and 2 USB ports which include their DAC up functionality, which if you're new to the Gigabyte line basically means if you want to connect an amp DAC unit to your motherboard, these are the cleanest power delivery options or ports that you can use. You also have Gigabit Ethernet and your full 7.1 audio with SPDIF as well, so and also USB 3.1 Gen 2 and Type-C as well, so a pretty comprehensive I/O. Now jumping into the BIOS, this is a pretty similar BIOS to most of your other Gigabyte boards. It's a little bit on the simpler and sort of almost old school side, with a lot of its features being sort of buried in menus. It's something that I'd still like to see improved, especially for things like overclocking, where if you want to do even a basic overclock by changing the multiplier and the voltage and maybe setting your XMP profile, you want to change those 3 things on a nice simple easy page, everything on one page for example. But with this motherboard you have to enter the advanced voltage settings or advanced frequency settings, change that, advanced memory settings and change that, and then go to your separate menu for voltage settings and change that. So it just makes it a little bit of a pain. While I do like the detail that they go into and really how advanced you can get with this board is really up to your own capabilities, it'd be really nice to see even just a beginner's version, or like even in the basic mode where you can just have your main overclocking options in a single page. That'd just be really nice to see. But otherwise the layout of the BIOS is nice enough. It's got a lot of features and support for you, as I said, and otherwise it's pretty decent. As I mentioned at the start of the video, overclocking on the board is pretty easy and it can definitely handle really high overclocks. So Gigabyte claims that it can handle about up to 4.6 gigahertz, which is really pretty impressive. Now I personally can't verify those claims, as I was only able to get about 4.3 gigahertz actually at the stock settings, where it would auto OC itself to about 4.3 all core with around about 1.4 to 1.5 volts just as stock. I did try to overclock in multiple ways on the board, but for stability reasons, and I think some BIOS updates might be needed, then I just can't get really high overclocks or even get close to actually manually overclocking it. So your results may vary, but the board itself is very capable of handling even up to that sort of 4.6 gigahertz limit that the Gigabyte themselves set. So with all of that out of the way, I'd love to hear what you think of it in the comments down below. Is this a sort of your dream board? Is this the thing you're going to be picking up, or is this way too expensive? Are you not a fan of Ryzen? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. So let's jump into the scoring. For me, this is a pretty high-end board. I think in terms of value for money, it's probably going to be a 4. In terms of performance though, it has to be a 5. Functionality, I'm actually going to go with a 5 because this is really very impressive, and styling is pretty nice. You can turn off the RGB if you want to, but there is a lot of RGB available, so it's actually going to be a 5. I really do like the look of this one. And in terms of the TechteamGB score, it's going to be a 5 and a Gold Award. This is a really impressive motherboard. I highly recommend it if you're after a top tier Ryzen board, and especially if you want to overclock pretty nicely. And otherwise, yeah, that's pretty much that. If you want to take a look at the board and check out pricing when and where you watch this, take a look at the link in the description down below. That will take you to your local Amazon store. Otherwise, if you want to support the channel, keep me making these videos on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday basis, then feel free to take a look at the Patreon link where you can support me directly, or the Amazon and Overclocking UK affiliate links, which massively help me out and definitely help, keep the lights on and the roof over my head. So thank you for using those if you do. There's also some other videos over here for you to check out, and if you are new to the channel, then feel free to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to be notified for future videos, especially the ASRock Pcie board, X470, and the X470 Asus Crosshair 7 Hero board. Feel free to check those out too when they're out. Otherwise, thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below, and we'll see you all in the next video.